waste and waste management. We're used to having our garbage picked up every day, commercial, residential, industrial. This was New York in the 1870s, before there were trash programs. Never before do we have so many people living in such close spaces in enclosed areas. And people were living in New York because there were a lot of jobs there, and they were living in these apartments. There was no form of garbage program. The garbage piled up. They just put out in the street. Unfortunately, there was so much garbage, it wouldn't just decompose quickly. It brought rats, or it brought vermin, it brought disease, and we knew something needed to be done about it. A lot of this brought in disease is brought in by other vermin, such as cholera, which is a lower intestinal issue, which can kill you. And this was spread primarily from the waste of animal droppings getting into the water, primarily rats, and subsequently it got in the water people were drinking, causing cholera. They knew at this point something needed to be done. One of the first methods to use to reduce garbage was called destructors. These were incinerators in England, and they could take 2,000 pounds of trash and turn about 100 pounds of ash. Now, back in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, we didn't have the different kinds of materials today. We didn't have plastics. We didn't have that much packaging. We didn't have a lot of metals we were throwing out. In fact, all it was primarily was food waste, yard waste, papers, as well as wood products. This was what we had, and this could easily be burned. The Public Health Act of 1875 addressed this formally. In addition to making sure we had a doctor in charge of public health for each community, local sanitary inspectors were appointed to make sure slaughterhouses were following best practices to make sure food wasn't contaminated or sold, and also cover sewers, supply fresh water to the local citizens, and collect rubbish, as well as provide street lighting. Even before the advent of the automobile, George Waring was the first waste disposal superintendent in New York City and developed street sweeping, refuse collection. This is, you can see on the lower left, by horse and buggy. Remote disposal, taking the garbage many miles away, so you wouldn't have to be within the local citizenry area. And then early recovery and recycling. These women here are pulling out cloth to actually recycle and make new clothes with. They were picking through the garbage here. And they could boil the clothes and then reuse, make something else with it. Landfills are not dumps. These are modern civil engineering masterpieces, actually. A lot goes into it. They usually look for an old quarry or old open pit mine where things can be enclosed. And what they do is they put garbage within there every day, and it's actually defined what area it should go in ahead of time. And that's covered every afternoon. So to reduce the vermin, the seagulls, all kinds of products. When they develop it, they got to make sure it's in a proper area in terms of so it doesn't leach into the water table if there is one underground. It usually has a membrane layer underneath, and it usually has another clay liner underneath that. And as we talked about before, the decomposition of living matter results in methane, and which is the primary component of natural gas. And they've actually been collecting natural gas from these landfills for about 25 years now. Now we look at the different components that go in solid waste, or municipal waste. Over a quarter of it is paper and paper products, 28.2%. And if you look at what the biodegradable components are, 28.2% of paper, food waste another 14%, yard waste 13%, and even wood 6.5%. That is about 2/3, which should still be decomposable altogether. What can be recycled is the glass, plastics, and metals, which makes up only about 25%. Then I talked about before, the landfill gas. It does primarily have methane, but also has carbon dioxide, which has to be removed. Once it's removed, it can go into the local natural gas company's pipelines. Now we've talked about natural protection for the landfills. with the geothermal layers as well as the clay lining has to be geologically secure in terms of it won't allow leakage into the water table. It's hydrological, make sure there's not a strong water table underneath it. The soil has to be the right components so it will decompose naturally. Meteorological conditions, if it's too dry, it may not decompose at all. And if it's too wet, we may get additional problems of mold and other issues being created. And then the migration of the water into the table must be very slow. So if there is a contamination, it can be stopped. We have hazardous waste in our homes. Hazardous waste should be taken care of by hazardous waste disposal. Unfortunately, for like most people, including me, you don't really consider hazardous waste you put in your garbage can. This includes paint cans, light bulbs, spray cans for like hairspray as well as spray paint, batteries, even shoe polish and shoe polish remover. There's a picture of a lot of this stuff, and you probably recognize most of it. And why I personally don't go to the hazardous waste site to get rid of these, most people don't. Problem is, these accumulate. If you got millions of citizens in the area all throwing this stuff out, it will create hazardous waste within our local biosphere. Now, in terms of waste management reduction, there's 4 areas, the 4 R's. Reduce what we use and the waste we discard. Use a large cup or 2 small cups, for example. Reuse. Reusing a water bottle could be a thing. Recycle. We'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of manufacturing wise, using the same materials over and over again. And recovery. This is waste to energy recovery. We're talking about burning. We still can do some of that now. Now, nuclear reactors, another form of waste that's being created. And nuclear reactor basically works by having the radiation from these nuclear rods touch very close to each other. They give off radiation, they heat each other up, and rather than using coal or oil to heat up the water, they use these control rods. Now, what happens with a meltdown is that these rods get so hot, they're not being controlled properly, that they'll bend and they cannot be put back into their control structure. Chernobyl in Ukraine, 1986, had a meltdown. And to this day, it's still heavily contaminated and deserted. You can see a lot of the mutations on the right of this cow, this cougar, from the radiation. And on the left is the residual of the meltdown from Chernobyl. That is, that stuff coming out of those pipes is corium. They call it corium, corium from the nuclear core. And 30 years later, scientists went over there and found out it is still 400 degrees. That's 30 years later. Now, the cost of garbage disposal, it's $30 per ton to recycle it. We still have to pay for recycling because not enough people are recycling for a manufacturer to change their methodologies. $50 to send it to a landfill, which is what most of us do, when their garbage is picked up, and then $65 to $75 to incinerate it. And it costs money to incinerate it because there's a lot of hazardous materials such as plastics and metals that are now within the waste stream. And when they burn, that creates hazardous waste, so those have to be removed. And recycling rates have increased over time. And you see the greatest component is the paper and paperboard, the cardboard. Unfortunately, this is kind of a misnomer because a lot what we consider recycling is recycled still in the paper plant before it ever goes outdoor. It could be the cuttings, the shavings of the paper. So if you see paper says recycled, if you look at it, it says 10% post-consumer, 90% pre-consumer. That means only 10% actually came from recycling by citizens. The other 90% actually came from the factory before it even went out the door. So technically it is recycling, but I'm not sure you can supports true sustainability. Metals have gone up quite a bit, primarily aluminum. Now glass, we have a glut. A lot of places aren't even recycling glass now. And then plastics, the biggest problem with plastics is there's 6 different types. Different kind of plastic for garbage bags, and there's for straws. Then there is for the tops of a soda bottle, then the soda bottle themselves, and we cannot mix those.